All right. Well, if you're ready, I'd like to get started, Daniel. Perfect. Well, yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tyler Mitchell. I'm the editor with Solana Bookshelf. I'm broadcasting out of our location in Flagstaff, Arizona, which does sit at the base of the San Francisco Peaks, a mountain that holds significance for many tribes, including the Diné, in which we call the mountain Doka Sleet. It's such an honor to be broadcasting out of a sacred space and working with Solana under a sacred space. So I do want to acknowledge the land and the many tribes that do call this place home, as well as to have some cultural significance for this wonderful place. And it's an honor to be here with all of you today. It is Indigenous Peoples Day. It's a day to honor our relatives, our ancestors who have fought hard and continue to fight for Indigenous voices and representations. And Native American literature has long been a tool for social justice and change in Native American communities and for Indigenous communities all over the world. It's an honor to carry on that legacy through Solana Bookshelf with incredible moments like this. Now, there was no harder worker or better writer to celebrate this amazing occasion with other than Daniel Vandever. Daniel Vandever uses his storytelling to share his Diné history, values, and teachings. But his storytelling not only accomplishes an important goal of showcasing the Diné lifestyle and history, but his craft and his two children's books offer new and creative ways to learn about history and teaching in and outside of the classroom. So today we will listen to Daniel speak of his two award-winning books, Fallen on Holden and Herizon. Thank you again for joining us today. Fallen on Holden follows Holden, a young Navajo boy, through his day at boarding school. Holden's vivid imagination transforms his commonplace surroundings into a world of discovery and delight. And it was named a 2017 Honor Book Award with the American Indian Library Association. And recently, Herizon came out as well. So Daniel's second book, Herizon, details the journey of a young Diné girl as she helps her grandmother retrieve a flock of sheep, aided by a magical scarf. Now, Herizon is a wordless book, and Daniel wrote that as an ode to missing and murdered Indigenous relatives and in honor of all those without a voice. And it's an incredible book, just so many things that go into form and craft in terms of storytelling that make it such an incredible feat. So thank you, Daniel, again for joining us today. I'd love to just get started and let you get on with Holden.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Tyler, and providing the space to be able to talk about my books, and for everyone who's in on the webinar to be able to share a lot of the why of why I write these books and how I see them as perhaps tools to help improve quality of life for young readers and really the communities in which I come from. And so I'm grateful to you for that. You want me to just get into it, or?
Yeah. So again, Indigenous Peoples Day is an important day to talk about history and storytelling. I think one thing that Fallen on Holden does is it teaches young readers an important part of history, especially Diné history. There's so much embedded in the way you use rhyme, so much embedded in the way that you represent the children and what they're doing throughout their day in boarding school. So I understand that there's a lot of history that goes into your storytelling, a lot of components that you want to teach young readers. So I'd love to just let you start off with history and Fallen on Holden.
So I think one of the things that is important being a Diné author is that there is purpose behind why I write. And a big part of that is really, encouraging a future for children in regards to literacy and education, but also speaking to a past which brought us to where we are today. And so in celebrating the day and celebrating, our right to exist and being able to be here today, I wanted to kind of talk about that history and how it influenced the two books that I wrote. And so to really talk about this history and, how I feel that there's still impacting to where we are today, I think you really have to look to the 1800s when a lot of the U.S. Army Navajo conflicts were taking place, the time of Barboncito, Manuelito, and Narbona. A lot of these conflicts generated out of, cross cultures happening in within the region of the Southwest, specifically Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, is where our land has traditionally been. And what that led to was a lot of conflict in the area, especially as Western movement and influence came into the territory. And as a result of the acquisition of the land that we were on, specifically through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but then also as bases started to happen on Navajo, such as Fort Defiance, Fort Wingate, a lot of that was a lot of contention and struggle, and this ultimately led to the Long Walk of the Navajo in the from 1864 to 1868. And I know Salina does a really good job of, promoting authentic voices and people who talk about these histories. So if you've seen read Dr. Parsons Yazi's Her Land, Her Love series, she talks really extensively about this period of history in which Navajos were removed from their homeland, marched clear across the state of New Mexico, over 450 miles in some cases, and relocated Diné on the Bosque Redondo, or what we called Huelte. And so this was a period that really was somewhat of a removal of our identity, especially the attachment to the land. And he talked about histories of being forced from our land, and a lot of people dying on that journey, and a lot of atrocities that happened. But as a result of that, I think there came to be an understanding, which ultimately led to the Treaty of 1868. But you'll see from these images what that walk was and what it entailed. Basically, over 8,000 Navajos were forced to this internment, somewhat of an internment camp out here in Fort Sumner. And you'll see all of the routes that had to be taken. But like I mentioned, we as a strong, resilient people ended up enduring into the Treaty of 1868. And what that did was allow us to return to our original homeland, which I believe we're the only tribe that was allowed to, was able to achieve in gaining that understanding. And as part of this treaty, Navajos were given an allotment of seeds, cattle, tools, and other material. This is when schools entered into the conversation, especially those for children aged 6 to 16. And then it came with conditions. A lot of Navajos were agreed not to interfere with construction of the new reservation, and that there would be no harm to any wagon trails or cattle passing through the lands. But that impact was immense in that it allowed us to return home, but it established these conditions in which we lived. As part of that, every family was given 2 sheep, and upon return, and it was kind of used as a way to, here's your 2, grow it and sustain yourself based off of this livelihood of livestock. And this period was so successful, especially with the arrival of the railroad in the 1880s, in allowing families to live their traditional ways on an economy based on wool agriculture, sheep. And it was successful because a lot of the rugs that were sent back, a lot of the wool, the mutton, whatever it might have been, came back into the households of the Navajo family. And this was important because it allowed us to maintain our traditional life ways, allowed our family units to stay together in producing these types of goods. And it was really a period of thriving, and until the 1930s, when the Livestock Reduction Act was enforced. And this was basically a mandate that eliminated livestock on Navajo. It was said to be because of overgrazing and destruction of the land. But really, it was a means to separate the Navajo from this lifestyle, from this way of living, from this not having to be dependent on anyone. And eventually it was really intended to force Diné into the wage economy. So where this is where you saw a rise in a lot of the extractive industries, mining, military service, things of that nature. And also boarding school was something that you saw happen as a result of this. And a lot of the kids were removed from their immediate family and put into these schools that preached Western society and intended to assimilate a lot of tribal members throughout the nation. So you'll see some of those pictures and how it was structured, which was really intended to kill the Indian, save the man type of mindset. But boarding school was really military structured. It was regimented and was really the inspiration for Fall in Line Holden. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a reading of Fall in Line Holden, knowing that history, knowing what goes into that mindset of kind of what brought us to that period of time was what I wanted to create this book for. Being able to provide space for grandparents, parents perhaps, to read something as innocent as a children's book with their family, but then perhaps have conversations about what boarding school was and what it was like. Because just one generation removed from myself, my father, the grandfather to my kid, this is a period of history that he had to endure and what he went through. And he has stories of getting punished for speaking his language and having to stuff his pants because he used to get spanked, and getting his hair cut and all of those things. And so, for me, it was a point of purpose to write a book that would allow those conversations to happen, because to me, a lot of the problems we're facing, perhaps as a community, as a nation, stem from this period of history, which I wanted to address. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and do the reading of Fall in Line Holden. So Fall in Line Holden, written and illustrated by Daniel W. Vandever. It begins. Deep in the heart of Indigenous nation stood a strict Western school of stern education, where everyone obeyed and did what they were told, and conformity ruled all to fit like a mold, until a boy fell out of line. What do you think that boy is? As class ends and recess begins, we all fall in line. We pass through the halls with art-covered walls. We all fall in line. We march left and then right with no end in our sight. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden! As the teacher yells at Holden, who, as you can see, wasn't following his classmates and somewhat lagged behind. And whereas all of his classmates passed the beautiful artwork that was on the wall, Holden actually stayed behind, and his imagination kicked in, and you saw the animals start to pop out at him. We bypass the laughs of the custodial staff. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden! As those joking janitors turned into rodeo clowns within Holden's imagination. We move slowly in silence with no words of defiance. We all fall in line. We pass the school's gym as a battle begins. We all fall in line. Our tired minds lag and our heavy feet drag. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden! The teacher exclaims, as you see that the dodgeball game turned into an ancient Roman battle. We pass the lunch crew to the smell of mutton stew. We all fall in line. as you see them passing the cafeteria. Holden's going to see something different, right? What do you think he's going to see? Fall in line, Holden! As those cafeteria staff members turned into witches. And it looks like the Sanderson sisters, right, from Hocus Pocus. We do as we're told and don't dare to be bold. We all fall in line. In respectable fashion, we pass the lab's distractions. We all fall in line. And though our backs ache, our spirits never break. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden. As you see that computer lab, all of the monitors and the seats come together to form a spaceship. And the two boys are now astronauts floating in the air. Our class rambles on to the band's rhythmic song. We all fall in line. Fall in line, Holden. As we see all of those music notes turn into singing birds. And those two boys now have instruments here. With the playground in sight and just a glimmer of light, we all fall in line. But as we reach the door, we can't take it anymore. And we all fall out of line. And so the story ends with Holden and his classmates making it to recess. And each of the kids are able to interact with his imagination, including the zebra from the art room, astronaut from computer lab, the joking janitor, and the warrior from the gymnasium. And so that's how the story ends.
All right, awesome. Thank you for that wonderful reading, Daniel. One thing I did want to talk about today is just the incredible craft that goes in with your story, especially with Fall in Line Holden. You talk about the strict mindset and the strict rules of boarding school. The book itself rhymes, and I wanted to talk a little bit about more of the finer details of your storytelling. So, yeah, the intentionality of the rhyming scheme of your story, as well as some of the images that we see throughout the book that I know with how much work you put in as a storyteller and as someone who wants to share history, what are some little finer details that people might overlook or might miss on their first read?
Well, yeah, thank you for that. I think there's a lot of intentionality that goes into this story that might be often overlooked. So I'm glad you're able to pick up on that, and I think it really helps contribute to the tone of the story. And so I know a few of the things that you had mentioned, the use of rhyme. I know when I was first doing research on this book and trying to decide how to approach it, a lot of the material said maybe don't use rhyming if it's not contributing to the story in one way or another, advancing what you're trying to do or say. Because oftentimes if you put rhyme into a book, you could go wrong in a lot of ways if it don't fit a nice little rhythm or scheme. And so it could be quite dangerous. But to me, rhyming was a big part of the story, especially as I wanted to incorporate some type of cadence or that rhythm I was talking to. Not only is that a literacy technique in order to help kids retain the information and perhaps catch on to it, we all fall in line. We all fall in line. And at some point, one of the kids who's reading this book might be able to anticipate when that's going to happen, see the words, and then make that association that helps towards literacy, as I had mentioned. But that rhyme also, I think, helps contribute to that tone of the story overall. Hopefully, I was wanting it to kind of elicit kind of a marching feel to the story. As you know, they're marching through the hallways. And as they're collectively stating this, these pages, with the exception of the Fall in Line Holden, is the voice of the students, and hopefully I was wanting to use those words to kind of bring in the imagery of kids marching in single file line in unison, somewhat like you had saw that picture when I was talking about boarding school, how they were in that line. So, things like that were really important to me, to keep consistent with the themes that I wanted to push, but then also really bring out that feeling of boarding school. You couldn't really talk about a lot of the histories that I knew of that my dad would tell me about growing up. You're not going to talk about getting spanked or hit or abused in children's books, because that's really not the place. But as I had mentioned, I wanted to provide the space for where those conversations could happen outside of it. And so all of these things contributed to that tone, how the students are kind of laid out. You see them here walking, kind of being faceless, but then also, you look at a picture like this, kind of being devoid of that, or void of their identity, not really having their faces penciled in. I hope that elicited a feeling to kind of say, man, especially in today's day and age where there's all these discoveries of people going missing, kids going missing, being buried at these boarding schools. I see these as those faceless individuals, kind of souls marching through these hallways, which gives it a kind of a grimmer tone. But it also kind of speaks to, Holden's identity and what they're kind of lacking, because he has the imagination. You see in some instances, even he's kind of missing that. That was a big part of it. A big reasoning behind that is oftentimes with the people being faceless, kids could then imagine themselves in that position and saying, I could be that character. But for my reasoning, a lot of that was to bring out, the harshness of boarding school, which comes within the visuals as well. Some of the other things that you might have seen is, all of the kids, they really are missing a lot of what Holden's seeing. And you might think about how do you develop a character? Well, I do that through Holden's classmates. So as you see, every time he gets in trouble from the very first place they pass, no one really takes notice. But as his influence grows, he gets in trouble, you start to see heads turn. So when you're talking about character growth and how do you install that into a story, I think one of the things that I had tried to do with this Fallen Line Holden book was to show his growing influence through his classmates. So he gets in trouble, a head turns. He gets in trouble, a head turns. Till eventually you get to the last page and everyone starts to fall out of line. And then they come into color, and then you see kind of that growth of him. He grows as a character by allowing others to see the world as he does. And so that was another big kind of thing that I put in there that is oftentimes missed by people who read the story. You might have also noticed, and I think, this last page is kind of a spread of hope, and that all of the kids' imaginations were able to grow and they're able to be themselves. But at the same time, I kind of see this as sad in a sense, and that they're not allowed to be who they are until they're finally almost out the door, and then until they're finally at recess and being able to come in color. It takes them to leave the confines of the boarding school walls to be who they are, and which I think is sad. But for Holden, I think when you have that imagination, when you're able to be who you are and see the world as you see it, the whole journey is that escape for him, where you get to this last page and he doesn't even have to leave the school because he's already experienced everything that these children are now getting to participate in. So putting that in was also a big thing, is how do you read this last page? Is it a page of hope? And I don't include the very last page. I'm not sure if you have it or if you could nab it from the book behind you. But there is one more image after it ends on the spread, where the kids are now walking back to their classroom. And you'll see, if you could hold it up, that they're in color at that point. Not only from this picture, but their faces are colored in. Yeah, there you go. And so you start to see, after this recess, that influence is coming back into the school's walls or buildings. And so, color, how you shape these characters, how you see them, all of that went into the tone of the story, which I hoped brought out that emotion in the book for people who are reading it. So a lot of little things like that. You might see this as a simple rhyming book. It's a children's pictures book, but those details, I think, help reinforce a lot of the motives I had put into it.
Yeah. No, that's such a great conversation to include so many intricate details to offer more conversations to be had. I wasn't really, I didn't catch on until you just mentioned how even the kids are kind of faceless. There's color missing, there's expression missing, and using that as a tool for kids to insert themselves into the book offers some sort of creative way for them to get involved more in the story itself. And that's definitely something you do a lot with Herizon, with it being a wordless book. We've had other conversations about the intention behind uh, Herizon being a wordless book. You've had conversations about the way you structured Holden and why it needed to rhyme and why there are several illustrations that are a certain way. And I think that's really powerful. And I think it's an incredible tool that I feel like teachers across the nation have kind of picked up on, is that these books teach history in a very specific way, in creative ways. And so thanks for sharing that. Thanks for having that discussion with us. I think it's incredibly important in terms of like Native American history, Native American literature, especially in general. So thanks for that conversation.
What I'm hoping to do is to promote outside the box thinking for our youth, perhaps even for our teachers. I think a lot of the problems we face today require that because they're so complex and complicated. And so I know that, again, this can't be a standalone book about boarding school. It should be a tool to help supplement, deeper dives, pairing it with different texts that talk about those specific stories, perhaps on the getting the haircuts or some of the harsher aspects of it. What that requires is some creativity from our educators and people who are willing to go that extra step into bringing them together and then packaging it as a lesson that could benefit our students. And so fortunately, I've probably given over, I'd say 75 readings since I've started writing these books. And there's a lot of hope in the teachers, the librarians, the caretakers who share these stories and bring that in and tie them together. And so I've been very fortunate that it's been well received in that way.
Definitely, I definitely think it is. You have a map in the back of Holden, and you also have some supplementary pages to kind of talk a little bit more about the things you see throughout Herizon as well. And so, for these books to be used as not only a storytelling tool for history and lessons, but to offer so many different tools for the teachers that are reading them to their kids, I think that's an incredible way to craft a story as an Indigenous storyteller. So I think that's definitely an incredible and creative way to get people involved, get them to listen more, get them to teach more. And again, thanks for that incredible conversation. So now I would love to move on to Herizon. So many incredible aspects about this book too. It is a wordless book for so many different reasons. The illustrations offer the children to get involved in the story themselves as well, the same way you do with Holden. So without further ado, I'd like to have you just get into it.
Okay. Well, you had mentioned, storytelling from an Indigenous perspective or Navajo perspective. I think there is a model that I followed in approaching the second book. And so I have a slide up here that talks about making that decision to write a wordless book. I know it kind of has people second guessing it. It was like, how do you have a children's book if there are no words to it? How do you read it? What do you do with it? Especially if you haven't really interacted with one before. So I really wanted to take that decision seriously. And so I worked 10 years in higher education. I worked at Navajo Technical University, who along with Diné College follow this model that informs how they approach learning and teaching and education in general. And it's this philosophy known as the Diné philosophy of education, which is based on the cultural principles of Nitzakes, Nahat'a, Ina, and Sehsin, which is basically a frame of thinking, planning, implementing, and reflecting. And I think this is something that a lot of people can relate to. How you approach life, perhaps, how you approach your day to day. I think that's where this philosophy really benefits yourself. But it's cyclical in that it allows for continual growth and understanding. So after you complete this phase, you think something out, you plan it, you do it, and then you reflect on it. It then continues. You then make that decision on, was it good? Can I move on to a different thing? Or were there some types of fallacies in that process that I need to go back and adjust and then do it again in order to correct it? But that allows for this continuous form of learning that could be applied to lessons in your class, how you structure a course, maybe even thinking about how you prepare kids from elementary into middle school to high school, college, and beyond. So it's a really important model that I think can help frame a lot of learning based on Navajo ways of knowing. And like I said, this philosophy could apply to day-to-day life or growth over the course of a lifetime. If you're thinking about it, maybe coming from an English writing course or perspective, you might think of it of how you structure a paper. You first think about what you're going to write about. You then perhaps plan it with an outline, or this is how I'm going to approach it. You write it, and then you do your edits or reflection, and then you go on to your next or second phase of writing and revisions. And so that's basically the mindset and the framework that I applied to in making this decision to write Herizon wordless. And so just to kind of show you how that looked, I'm going to go ahead and go through each of those cultural principles or these terms and why I made that transition into writing a wordless book. For one, I think wordless books really do promote early literacy and that they're able to launch emergent readers into a love for books and perhaps reading by unlocking imaginations. Wordless books really encourage the development of many reading comprehensive skills that benefit them as readers of books, not only with text, but also those with pictures. It could be applied to both. And so wordless books all really do have benefit in emerging readers and those who are starting to get into reading. Wordless books also provide a lot of avenues or ways that you can incorporate culturally responsive teaching, especially because wordless books encourage children, youth, adults, whoever's participating in the reading of the book to interpret each part of their story in their own personal way. And so how you read this book with your child, how they interpret it, might reflect some things that you learn a little bit about where they're coming from or how they see it, as opposed to how you as an adult might read it, or as me as a male and then you as a female might receive the story. And really that gives you some insight into the cultural background in which you come from. This approach can connect students with different cultures, languages, perhaps life ways within classroom learning. And this ultimately promotes inclusivity, bringing voice to the table, which often is lacking or missing. Wordless books also promote social emotional learning. When readers are able to put their own words to pictures, they feel successful, happy, and enthusiastic about the story. This can then open dialogue and engage students, children to share their experiences from their own families or communities, which I think contributes to better understanding of the world we live in. But then wordless books can be that tool to improve self and social awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, and then relationship skills. I'm a firm believer that post-COVID, a lot of delays have happened in how people interact with the world, and rightfully so. I think we've distanced ourselves and isolated ourselves in a sense, but as students start to engage, reintegrate into the classroom, a lot of these social emotional management mechanisms are lagging. And so a book that's wordless could help draw conversations around those types of things. each of these things then contribute to community building. And so again, these are all the things I was thinking about when I decided to make that decision. Students share their own interpretations because there are no words that interfere with the telling of a story. And then this allows teachers and classmates to get a glimpse into what they value, where they come from, how they interpret the world. And then all of these things then help build that community, being able to share experiences, to find commonality in upbringing, perhaps. And this applies to not only building community in your classroom, but then beyond into the community, into the everyday life, into the home, whatever it might be. And so this is really about finding voice. This is where teachers, parents, whoever is reading a book with their kids, because wordless books are often interactive, it helps teachers meet students where they are by individualizing the instruction for each student, no matter what their prior experiences have been or what their current abilities might be. And so, thinking about wordless books, these are all the considerations, the benefits you might see that go into it. And so how did I plan around that? Again, making my outline, putting these boxes that I want to be able to address with this book, is that I wanted to be able to plan around building confident, independent readers. Individual personal interpretations of these pictures, of these wordless books, and how I structure them allows a storyteller to always be right. There are no wrong answers in how one interprets a wordless book because there's nothing dictating how it should be. This kind of transpires as readers first assigning labels or words to these pictures, but it could be used as a tool to build vocabulary and noticing characters, settings, problems, solutions, and other basic story structures and themes that you would want to talk about. So later, those types of skills could then be translated to books with text, helping readers decode unknown words and then using picture cues and context clues. So you might even think and look at this picture right here. What does that do? If you're able to tell and assign how you see this image, how does it relate to the story? What prior experiences can you bring into it? Can you talk about, Aladdin and growing up with that, and maybe even singing a whole new world and interpreting this and how you're describing it? Those types of things help build that confidence of the readers that you're trying to speak to. It allows for individuals to make those cultural connections. I was really wanting to plan around the idea that readers and pre-readers of all ages can share their knowledge of culture, history, geography, perhaps family norms and customs. So images like this ciel you see here is going to appear in the book. What can somebody who's in a classroom share with the rest of the class about this image that they probably might have experienced? Maybe a kid going through kinota and the importance of having a ciel, or being brought up by somebody, a grandmother perhaps, who stressed the importance of keeping your hair tidy and well kept rather than free flowing and wild. You're able to bring in those cultural experiences into the conversation, which helps in better build on the story. Readers tell their own stories, rich in detail from those own experiences. And then this helps build literacy skills. Remember, that was one of the things that I wanted to contribute to. Within wordless books, children and students have the opportunity to practice things like listening comprehension and speaking, storytelling and story retelling, building vocabulary, predicting and inferring with no words to interfere, and no decoding necessary ultimately to become confident readers. And then you're able to bring in things like language. I think Herizon lends itself to the development of both English and Navajo language vocabulary, and really any language and how you bring it together. And then finally, I wanted to plan around mastering these story elements. Again, the big thing I wanted to do was promote literacy. And so you'll see that there's a lot of opportunities for you to dive into story elements. Things like characters, settings, and plot, problems and solutions, identifying the beginning, middle, and end of a story theme. And so all of those things together could then be used as activities to help prompt your kid or your students into better understanding each of these elements. So if you were to look at this coyote over here, You could talk about how does it fit in with the theme? Who is this character? Perhaps you could get into the backstory of this character when you're telling it with your kids, but you're able to dive into it and have those conversations. And so all of those things went into the planning of the story, which then allowed me to write it. And so I'm going to go ahead and do the reading of Herizon for you all here, and keep those things in mind. It's also going to be a story written about that history I was talking about when I started this conversation, specifically on the lifestyle of raising sheep, and the importance of it in bringing together family and the intergenerational aspects of it. And like Herizon being a tool to talk about the history of boarding school, I was hoping that Herizon could be a tool to bring in conversations about, growing up being a sheep herder, or sharing experiences of weaving and what that impact has been on your family, and the importance of sheep and livestock. And so, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and do a reading of Herizon. So it's a wordless book. I know we don't have an unmute button associated with this webinar, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it as if I were to be reading to kids in the classroom, or maybe even at home. But I'll do some prompts. I'll ask questions. I'll talk about different images as I would if I were to be promoting a lot of the things I had discussed about the benefits of writing a wordless book. So without further ado, Herizon, story by Daniel W. Vandever, illustrated by Corey Begay. And the story begins. It looks like we're here at this household. And I like to ask, what do you see? What do you notice? Sometimes when we read wordless books, we really have to use our eyes to identify what's happening in the images. So one of the things you might be drawn to right away is this lady right here, which looks like an elder, if you could use your eyes and senses to see the cane she's holding, the skirt, and then her masana scarf right here. If you look a little bit closer, you might see that there's some puppies sleeping underneath the porch. But if your eyes are drawn to the girl inside, you could see that she's standing at a sink, doing something, we're not quite sure yet. But our eyes are drawn to grandma here. Can you see what's in her hand? What does she have? It's like binoculars, right? And typically use binoculars if you're looking at something into the distance. I wonder what grandma's looking at. Here we can see that grandma is actually looking in the distance, and she's checking up on her sheep. And what looks like some lazy boys sleeping on the job right here, because as they're sleeping underneath this tree, the sheep are starting to wander. What do you think grandma would be thinking right here? Seeing this, what do you think she would say to her two grandsons? And you can see that grandma takes her cane. She bangs on what appears to be the door to get the girl's attention. And now we could see what that girl is doing inside. We could see that she's doing dishes, some dish soap at the sink. But grandma's got her attention. And with doing dishes, you tend to have wet hands. So as she's going towards grandma, she takes the dish towel, dries off her hand, and she sees grandma. What do you think grandma's telling her in this instance? What is she saying? As she points into the distance. We see that the girl now has those binoculars. You think she's seeing what grandma sees? Let's find out. And what does that girl see? She doesn't see those lazy boys. She still sees the sheep wandering off. But instead of seeing her cousin sleeping on the job, she sees what looks like 3 hungry coyotes with sheep on their mind. And how do you think it makes the girl feel? How would you feel right here? Have you ever felt like that? You can tell she's kind of looking a little worried, right? Maybe even scared. She's clutching those binoculars a little tight. Have you ever felt like that? But what does grandma do? She gives her scarf. What do you think she's saying to her in this instance? As little puppies right here off to the side watching. And what does the girl do? If her grandmother said, go wake up those boys and get the sheep. You can see that as she's leaving home, she goes from a walk into what looks like a sprint. What does she do with that scarf? Looks like she throws it over her head. What do you think is going to happen as it looks like she's running off the page? What do you think she's going to do with that scarf? You can see that she's flying. It looks like it's flying high with her, almost like it's a hang glider. And you can see against the backdrop, she's here in Monument Valley, Arizona, or Utah. You know a lot of the old Western movies. This is where you might have seen a lot of those movies by John Wayne. We see an animal below. Is that the coyote? Let's find out. And you can see that that girl is almost using that scarf as a hang glider as she floats almost gracefully high above with those butterflies. But as she's getting closer to the ground, you see that those aren't coyotes, but in fact are horses, a stampede of them. What do you think she's going to do as she gets closer to the ground? Think she might ride one of those horses? Let's find out. And now you see that she actually does, and that hang glider she had then turns into a saddle blanket. I think she's riding fast or slow here. Can you tell by the pictures? Looks like she's really going fast, right? As she distances herself from this brown horse she was riding next to, until we see on the next page, whoa, as that horse hits the brakes, and there goes the girl flying. Think she's in danger there? What do you think is going to happen? If you notice, use your eyes, we see that there's a river below. This is where you'd say, cannonball! As she makes a splash into the river right next to some driftwood. And you can see that that saddle blanket is now almost a cape protecting her as she goes into the water. Until she then uses that scarf to pitch a tent as she's floating down the river. How do you think the girl feels here? Do you think she's safe? Looks like she's almost collecting herself, right? As she's sitting on the driftwood, squeegeeing out her scarf. Looks like she's almost calm in a sense as she's sitting there. Think about it. What do you know about this setting? What is water? Sometimes they say water is life, right? Maybe she's kind of recollecting herself after getting bucked off her horse, and they're collecting herself in this moment. But is she really safe? Now you can see that that river is heading straight for a waterfall. A little rendition of Grand Falls out there in Flagstaff out by Tyler at Salina. It's not as muddy, but you'll see that that's what the girl sees is a waterfall. And what does she turn that tent into? We now see that scarf transform into a magic carpet. And as she escapes that ledge, here she is flying high above Chinle, Arizona, more specifically in Canyon de Chelly or Spider Rock. If you know the significance of this area, Spider Rock is where the Diné learned how to weave from Spider Woman. So this is a sacred site that she's flying high above. And you can see that she's almost revived by this Spider Rock because she's doing a nice little lap around it, flying high against those cliffs. Now we're starting to see her make her descent. Maybe she's getting closer to her destination. And now we see that that scarf, that magic carpet, is now a parachute. She starts to get closer to the ground. And who are our old friends that we're now seeing in this picture? You might have noticed those lazy boys still sleeping on the job over here. The sheep wandering. And there's 3 hungry coyotes coming closer and closer. You think the girl's gonna get there in time? Let's find out. Now you see that parachute turn into a slingshot as she stares down those coyotes. She even shoots a rock over them as she chases them off. But if you notice, there's 3 coyotes up here. There's only 2 over here. Wonder where that other coyote went. Now we see that slingshot turn into a lasso. As that sheep is running away, there's that last coyote. And just in the nick of time, she ropes that sheep. And just for good measure, that rope now turns into a whip as she chases off the last coyote. And how do you think the girl feels about that? How do you think she feels here? Do you think she's still worried or nervous or scared? Like when we saw her when she was ready to go on her journey? Or is she more empowered and tough like grandma as she sees them running off into the distance? You even see her telling off her cousins right here. We're just now waking up. So we're brought back to the cover of the story. And now we see that that scarf turns into a hot air balloon as it floats back home. And we see the 3 boys are awake, chasing the sheep back as the girl kicks back and supervises from above. Now we see that the girl is home. How do you think she feels here? How would you feel? Perhaps you'd feel accomplished or proud because you saved the day. But look at her head's hanging. Maybe she's a little sad. How would you feel if you had to return your powers or your weapons or your protection? Something that helped you save the day. Maybe she's going to have to go home and do the dishes again. Would you be happy about having to go home and do the dishes after saving the day like that and being a hero? But what does grandma do? She doesn't give her back the dish rag, does she? Instead, she turns her around and ties up her hair into that TA, to the Navajo bun, using that scarf, perhaps passing on her knowledge, her experience, her hope for the future, and the little girl. And so we see the girl not returning to the kitchen to do dishes, but looking off into the distance with her hair tied up. If you look really closely, you could see those lazy boys actually come finished and did their job. They returned the sheep, but we're left with the girl looking off into the distance. And so it ends with her tying up her hair, ready to take on her horizon. Perhaps it's going back and finishing off the coyotes, making sure that she's protecting her family's sheep. Perhaps she's going to go back and work in IT and bring internet to her community, bring clean energy. Maybe she's going to address something like COVID, become a doctor, and protect her family from viruses. You see Window Rock in the background. Perhaps she's going to go off and work in government, be the first female president of the Navajo Nation, which I think is desperately needed. And so that's how we're left with the story of Herizon. Thank you.
All right. It's always such an incredible experience to see you read and walk through your stories with us. An incredible job. So thank you again for this reading and discussion. One thing I was pointing out is, again, you always learn something new when I hear you talk and speak about your work. Definitely one thing I love about your 2 books is your ability to incorporate so many teaching tools within it, and in either in the structure itself or the ways that you incorporate history, or the ways that you want to use your Diné philosophy to start thinking about, okay, well, students learn a certain way, or every student is different. And taking that approach into your storytelling, I think is really, really incredible. And one thing I did notice that I always notice and want to point out is that you do have different icons throughout all the pages. You also have a page at the back of the book that has some key terms, some key ideas that help teachers further talk about some of the concepts that are within your story. So if you could talk about some of those tools that you use within Herizon, talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah. So thank you for kind of bringing it back to me. I kind of cut off the whole DPE conversation after I got done reading it or completing it. But then that would be the next phase, is I wanted to address literacy when writing this wordless book. The next phase you would do after producing it is to do a little reflection on, did you achieve your goals? So one way I wanted to be able to do that or measure it is to have conversations in the classroom of students comprehending it and then applying some type of connection to it. So perhaps the one thing you might want to do is be able to provide what's known as a text to self connection, where you ask your kid or your students if they can relate to the story or to any specific character and why. And if they cannot relate to any of the characters, perhaps they can relate to the experiences of the characters or settings. So again, this is where you're kind of diving into the literacy techniques of, or the literacy story elements of characters, setting, and place, making those connections to yourself. Once you're able to do that, you could do a text to text type of connection, where you might choose more than one wordless books that seem to follow the same theme as Herizon. And then follow that same routine of understanding the characters, the place, the plot, or what's happening with this new book, as you did with Herizon, and then help the children find similarities between the two books. And then you're able to then make text to world connections, revisit Herizon, and ask students to make connections and similarities they find in their own lives between Herizon, mixed characters, settings, and plot, etc. So this is then completing that thought. You produce it, then how did students comprehend each of those story elements in learning? And so you had mentioned that there were certain icons within the story, which is definitely true. If I were to go back, you see the C here. I included what's known as a pre-teaching prompt before the story began. So I kind of just jumped into the story. But if you have the book with you, on the dedication page, explains how you use a wordless book. So if somebody were to just pick it up and didn't necessarily know how to get into it, there's a character icon that you see here, an S icon, and then a T icon, which is intended to dive deeper into the character, the setting, and then the transition or the plot of what's happening. So then you're prompted into then talking about each of those at these crucial moments in the book. For instance, right here, when she's having to return home, and you're diving into the character and understanding where they are in this moment in the book. What's their mindset? Did they grow? What was that experience? And so things like that, I think, really help further guide readers if they needed it. Oftentimes readers don't. But I wanted to provide those types of things in there, including at the very end, I had a discussion guide, which could be used as a tool for conversations to happen. And then you go back and then you complete that circle again. After perhaps mastering the story elements from your first phase of DPE, you might then go back and return and, how can we then use this to help promote and educate on writing? So if your students are advanced enough to write, wordless books like Herizon could then be ideal as something that starts with writing prompts. Many students who struggle with writing prompts that are one sentence starters, that can be difficult for them, but if they're able to write to something that they could see and view like a wordless books, it helps a little bit more. These wordless books give students more visual materials which they can write about, and it's really based on the idea that good storytellers become good writers. If your student or kid could tell the story of Herizon, they most probably will be able to write the words to tell the story. And then this allows students to draw upon their imaginations, prior personal experiences to write what they see, feel, and think. And so if you notice between both books, I really wanted to stimulate imaginations, encourage people to see things differently and in their own way. And this could be a prompt to do that. Could also think creatively if you're going to be writing after you are able to get writing down for students. You might be able to come up with prompts. How can your kid or student create a prequel or tell what happened before the story began? They can also change or expand the ending of the story. So what happens with the coyotes, perhaps, or what led to the coyotes approaching the sheep? This allows your students to, once they master the basic story elements and then writing, how do you start thinking creatively? Students can add dialogue, perhaps, to bring the characters to life. The illustrations would help with word choice and descriptive language. And then more advanced writers should be able to extend the story by focusing on one character, perhaps, and writing their backstory of that individual. Or there could be an original future story for the characters that would take place after the story ends. So when she's looking at the horizon, which route do you want to write about? And you go from there. And so really that's contributing to that DPE philosophy, which I wanted to build in there. So it helps contribute to learning. So.
All right. Thank you for that wonderful conversation. I always hear that the purpose of your writing is to promote creativity. That's definitely evident in Holden, especially with that being one of the central messages of Holden, and to see how you develop that into Herizon a few years later. So many components, so many things to think about, which I think you accomplished really well with your storytelling. So again, thank you for your conversation and thank you for all of that. I would like to open the floor to anyone in attendance. If you would like to go ahead and ask a question or talk about any of the themes that we've talked about today, go ahead and leave those questions in the chat. Or if you'd like to raise your hand, I can go ahead and unmute you and you can use your own voice to conversate with us today.
Yeah, as you think about those questions and if you get the courage to ask one, I think that was a big thing that how the two tied together. Was that I wanted to use the experiences I had from going around and doing readings with Fall in Line Holden in the classroom and use that to build on what I was doing with Herizon. And how that really kind of worked was I noticed that there was a lot of students who felt intimidated by when I would come in and read and would sit in the back or off to the side and wouldn't necessarily participate or really engage with what was happening. And a big thing I wanted to know was why. Was it something that had to deal with being shy or maybe not being strong enough in your literacy skills to read along with the story? And that was one of the benefits I saw with wordless books and why I wanted to speak and take that approach is because oftentimes the students who should be engaged with story times are often forgotten. And so wordless books allow those individuals to then participate in the story. And as it was mentioned, this was a story written for the voiceless in the classroom, voiceless in the home, voiceless in the community, speaking to things like MMIW. ICWA is another big thing right now, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is legislation that speaks to, placement of children in foster care. And oftentimes it doesn't recognize things like intergenerational homes or how kids could go live with their grandparents or extended family. And so a book like this helps start and stimulate those conversations. And so I wanted to write it in that way.
Yeah, no, that was another thing I wanted to talk about is just how not only is your storytelling embedding the Diné philosophy, but what are some of the ways that you promote, the way that you read, the ways that you go and hold these community events? Is there any type of like Diné philosophy that you carry into how you present the book as a writer and a reader?
I think my philosophy behind it and how I go out and speak to it is just that concept of care and that we're related and relations and networks and how it's like kind of a community. If you're going to address these problems, it's not just going to be you, it's going to be everyone. And so my whole philosophy is if you have Native American students, if you serve Native American communities, I'll give a free reading to you and talk about these things and have these conversations because I think that's where change happens is we're working together and addressing these things collectively. And so my whole approach is that I don't want to turn anyone down. I want to have these conversations so change could happen because collectively it's going to take all of us, the authors writing the story, the publishers and editors who create them and get them out to everybody. And so that's my big thing, is I want to be able to work collectively with everyone and share our connectivity in addressing these problems, because there's a lot of similarities in what we're working towards that could be drawn together by something as creative as a children's book.
Yeah, exactly. I've known you to do so many, to be very vocal in your reading events. You recently did the Navajo Nation Museum reading with Brian Young as well, and so this coming together of storytellers on multiple occasions, either inside the classroom or inside the community events that are held on the Navajo Nation. I think you've done a great job of promoting which is a big value and moral behind the books that you create. So I think you've done an excellent job of all of that today. So thanks again for joining us for the reading. If you'd like to purchase Holden or purchase Herizon, you can go ahead and visit Daniel's website at southofsunrisecreative.com. And are there any last words you'd like to say, Daniel?
No, just thank you for what you do and all the support at Salina Bookshelf. Telling stories, our stories, is important. And I think if we're not telling them ourselves, someone else will tell them for us. And so Salina Bookshelf is, somebody who cares. They'll work with you to have your story told, and they're producing high quality literature that I think is necessary today. So thank you for what you do in contributing towards, creating a better world basically through books. I really am a strong supporter of Salina and thankful for where I am today. It wouldn't be possible without you. So thank you to you, Eric, the whole team.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And thank you again for all your kind words and your insight and your creativity. I think you've done such a good job to support Native American literature, but not only that, just the community around literature itself, the community of schools and wherever there's a place to be taught an important lesson in Diné history or values or language. I think the stories that you create are an important key part of that. So thanks again. Thanks for everyone for coming out. And Daniel Vandever, thank you again. And happy Indigenous Peoples Day.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right. Have a good one.